Morning, boys. So today we're gonna go through sort of the beginning of this play, Act 1, sort of give you some activities, some stuff to do. Should be in your books, and then I'm gonna post this video, and then I'll post another video where I go a little bit more in depth into the first act, and just sort of cue you into things you should be paying attention to, different techniques, different forms, characterization, stuff like that. So we'll go through this first, and we'll just sort of overview some of these things. And remember, it's your job to do everything that's on these slides, get it down into your books, so that when we collect them next week on Monday, we'll be back. Praise the Lord. We won't have any problems. And I'll say this now, and I'll post it at some point as well. They should be done when we come in on Monday. I'm not going to, oh, give me one more day. I'm not going to give you another day. I'm going to collect them. Whatever's in there is going to be your attendance. So that's why it needs to be dated. That's why it needs to be done. So let's go form. You know, this is a drama. Come on, buddy. All right. So obviously this is a dramatic form, and it is a tragedy. This is not necessarily a classical tragedy, like we studied with Lear. This is more of a modern tragedy, and the big difference is classical tragedies usually center around a king and his flaws, whereas a modern tragedy is more about the common man and his flaws. So the protagonist in this play is John Proctor. He's very much the everyman, and he is the one who is sort of has that tragic flaw, hamartia, as it's also known. Miller chose drama, and obviously he's a playwright, so makes sense. But he chose drama because it's an important vehicle for affecting the audience in a visceral way. They can see the action unfold in close proximity, and thus are compelled to project themselves onto the stage and share in the emotions of the characters. I chose theater because it was the cockpit of literary activity, and you could talk directly to an audience and radicalize the people. He wanted them to see this with their own eyes, especially with everything that was going on, political, as this is a political allegory for the Red Scare and everything that's going on at this point in 1950s America. He wanted people to see it for their own eyes, and elicit this visceral, this emotional reaction, connection to what's happening, maybe to enable them to see what's right in front of them. It's a tragedy, human frailty, catastrophe, and powerlessness, but for a greater purpose. And the structure here is it's in media res, so it begins in the middle of the story. Two events crucial to the drama have already taken place. The girls are dancing in the woods, and Proctor's affair with Abigail. They've already happened, and they're critical to the story, but that's before we began. So this is sort of in media res, which means it begins sort of after some critical events have already happened. Dramatic features. So these are the things that we need to see. This should be copied in your books. These are the things that we're going to use when we're writing. And I would prefer we use these techniques. So these would be called macro techniques. Bigger techniques that aren't necessarily stylistic. They can be more conceptual, as opposed to micro techniques. And micro techniques would be things like simile, personification, alliteration, stuff like that, which is important in a lot of ways, but not necessarily if we're going to convey a depth of analysis. Macro features, such as these ones here, are going to be more critical. Stage directions, we should know what that is. It's the director sort of saying how things are, maybe giving us a hint here or there. There's a lot more stage direction in this than in Shakespeare. Shakespeare is pretty notorious for not using much stage direction. Some directors use, or some playwrights use, an incredible amount of it. The dialogue, dramatic irony, symbolism, and the structure. And the structure, this is a 4-act play. We'll go a little bit more into that in a minute. But there's also within the acts, this people have considered the Crucible to be a master class in building tension. And in each act, there is this building of tension, this slow simmering, and each act sort of ends with this climax within itself, obviously culminating in a climax at the end, more broadly. But this is it's a little bit different. So other techniques, we're going to see something called authorial intrusion. They're all throughout the play, and essentially it's just Miller directly commenting. He'll come right in and just comment either on the characters, and he'll even make statements that are just thinly veiled, contextual statements, sort of positioning these events with the events that are happening currently in his time. So that's an important technique that we should be able to identify pretty easily, and it is a technique that Miller uses quite effectively, and it is quite unique to this play in particular. The significance of the title, quite a bit of symbolism and motif. There's a lot of it's a motif of sort of light and dark throughout this play that I'd like you to cue in on as you're reading. There's characterization, character foils. Character foils are characters that are just sort of meant to sort of be compared with one another, to sort of magnify each other's qualities. We'll see character foils, sort of Elizabeth and Abigail, Elizabeth Proctor, John Proctor and Hale and Paris. All of these in Hale and Danforth, these characters, when put side by side, we can sort of see it sort of magnifies their qualities and sort of it makes them stand out even more than they already do. Allegory, as we've talked about, this is a political allegory. This is historical allusion throughout. Miller got a lot of this from he went to Salem and did a lot of research for this. And a lot of this is based on actual transcripts that were written at the time. This actually happened. This is a real event. Obviously, it's dramatized for his purpose, but this really happened. So, not only is this sort of an allegory for the time, this is also a reminder to us as the audience that history does repeat itself, and that although we may think of ourselves as being more civilized than times past, we do similar things, not just individually, but collectively, politically, institutionally. Historically authentic language, he tries to keep this as true as possible to that time, and we all know what metaphors are. So this is a tragedy. We're going to have things, this is going to be a tragic hero. It's going to be John Proctor. He's going to have that tragic flaw, also known as hamartia. It's going to be sort of his pride, his hubris. So throughout, there's going to be a tragedy. It's going to lead to this enlightenment. There's a little bit different. Here is Proctor dies at the end. Spoiler alert, you should have read it by now already. But he doesn't necessarily lose. His death is symbolic, it's sacrificial, it ends in a victory for his community. And a lot of times tragedies don't end that way. They just end in L's all around, right? Loss. And so it's a little bit different in that regard. These tragedies about universals, right? It should be universal across human experience, across multiple contexts. Even though these ideas are very pointed and they're very pointed towards, American politics and American institutions, that doesn't mean they can't be carried over into other cultures and societies. This is going to be a big part, catharsis. If you've heard this word, a cathartic release, it's just sort of the purging of something, usually emotion. In this case, it would be purging of fear, and so this society they live in is extremely oppressive, extremely repressive. They hold things in, they don't express themselves, and this witch trial is going to be an opportunity for them to sort of release a lot of these repressed emotions and resentments. So in a lot of ways, there's a collective catharsis going on here, and then individually we'll see catharsis as well. So read through these, sum these up for me. As I said, this is a 4-act structure. The play is made of 4 acts. Across these 4 acts, you see a gradual heightening of its crises. Miller charts the development of the hysteria surrounding the Salem witch hunt through climatic evolution of the play. This demands greater emotional investment from the audience so that the play's end, as as we, the audience, are intensely self-aware of the same fear that is proliferating in our own context. He wants us to sort of see it develop and see that we can sort of, as we, the audience, especially the audience in the 1950s, would have been very acutely aware of the similarities between this and their own context, all the way to the end. So there's a gradual elevation of these crises, but there's crises throughout each act. And each act sort of serves a different purpose. It's Act 1, locating this blame for both private and public problems. It's in Paris's home. Act 2 shows sort of this invasion into the proctor's home. There's this bridge between the public and the private, the collective and the individual. Proctor's not even safe in his own home. Act 3 is sort of in the church, and this is where it becomes very public. And it's sort of where this trial begins, and where Proctor seems to need to put aside his desire to remain private, to save his wife. And Act 4 is the culmination of all this, and it ends in John Proctor's sacrifice. Close analysis. So we're going to do this, and then I'm going to do this again right after this, so don't worry too much about breeze through this. I'm going to go back and we're going to do this a little bit more. I'm not going to read through it line by line, but I'm going to go through some of the finer points of Act 1 and sort of overview some of the characters and some of the things I want you to pay attention to as we move forward. This play, I'm assuming not all of you have read it. I'm hoping you've all read Act 1, but if we read all 4, it's going to make a lot more sense. But if not, I'm going to tell you what to look for while we're progressing through this play. Act 1, the summary. This is in Paris's house. He's the Reverend of Salem, and it's in his daughter Betty's room. Betty is sick. They fear that she's the victim of witchcraft. They found them dancing in the woods, doing some strange things, and she's fallen ill and hasn't woken up. Abigail is sort of the ringleader, and she will become the antagonist of this play. She's sort of representative of Joseph McCarthy, which again was sort of a shot by Miller to say you're no better than a petty teenage girl. But Abigail is a complicated character. She's very complex, and a lot of it is, her persecution of others is also sort of symbolic of sort of the repression of women as well, where you can sort of see her as being a victim of a very patriarchal society that's sort of ruled by men and not for women. Thomas and Ann Putnam come in. They're also sort of antagonists. They sort of flame the fire. They sort of disappear later, but they're sort of the initial ones who are looking, maybe see this as an opportunity, witchcraft to sort of gain power and maybe deal with some resentments that they have. Abigail, Mary, Mercy talk together. The girl's motives are revealed. Betty wakes up screaming and reveals that Abigail has asked Tituba. Tituba is the slave of Paris. And again, she begins this play. She's in it, and it is again very, very clear that she's marginalized and that she's going to be pressured to do whatever they tell her to do because she has no power. Abigail as well. They're powerless in this society. They're women, and Tituba especially, because she's a woman of color. She's a slave. She's literally the property of Paris. So even if she's telling the truth, they say that's not the truth we want to hear. There's not really much she can do about it. Abigail and John Proctor then speak, and it's revealed that John Proctor and Abigail had an affair. It's also revealed that Abigail has a very deep resentment for John Proctor's wife, Elizabeth, which is important because that's sort of the fuel for this whole thing. That's why she was in the woods, because she wanted to wish ill on Elizabeth using this dark magic of Tituba, who's originally from the Barbados, which is in the Caribbean. We're then introduced to Rebecca Nurse, Giles Corey. They're good characters. They're generally good people, moral, upstanding people. And that's important because they will be persecuted moving forward. Persecuted for not bending and for maintaining their integrity through this whole thing. And so it's suggested that the society is rife with conflict, laying the foundation for the resentment / ulterior motives for the outcry of witchcraft. That's significant as well. Again, that idea of catharsis, and this idea that this is such a repressed society that this was sort of a powder keg, and that this witchcraft was just this, everybody could just start pointing fingers. And if somebody stole your land or killed a pig, or you thought that they put evil spirits on you to kill your children, then all of a sudden they were witches. That was an easy way to get them out of the way. That's something that Putnam's do. Putnam's trying to get land, and he says, well, I think they're witches, so they're gone out of the picture, and well, who's here to take their land, right? Reverend Hale arrives. He's a very significant character. He's an expert in witchcraft, and he's done this in other towns before. He's a foil to Paris. I believe he's also a foil to Proctor as well. And it's sort of the same way Proctor wins at the end, Hale sort of loses, because he's very steadfast in his beliefs at the beginning, but by the end he's very disillusioned and he's questioning his beliefs. This idea of dichotomies, he'll represent that. There's an important passage there. Tuba is called in, and Reverend Hale lays the foundations for the accusation to file. The scene ends, and essentially the girls are just yelling, such and such is a witch, such and such is a witch, which again this is foreshadowing that this is going to continue. Here's some links to the rubric. So examine this. Try and find some ways that this sort of links to the rubric, different things, examples. So how texts represent individual and collective human experiences, social repression leading to the individual repression and resentment. This builds the central point of tension in the play. There's a conflict between the individuals and the collective. The individuals represented as struggling against the oppression and the injustice. This can be seen sort of with the girls in the woods, dancing in the woods, that it's them doing that is very much a result of their repression as teenage girls in the society. They're not given any room to do anything except follow the rules and be good, obedient young women. And you see that with this rebellion, which is not unusual, right? Teenagers rebel. That's what they do, but not in this society. And so there's that conflict there. You can see so human inequalities and emotions associated with the arising from these experiences, fear and paranoia dictate individuals' actions in the act. You'll see that with Paris. Right from the beginning, you can tell that Paris, who although is the reverend of the town and supposed to be an upstanding person, of high moral fiber, is immediately, he's more concerned with his reputation, even more so than his own daughter, who is lying catatonic in her bed. So that is something you immediately noticed, and he's scared that if witchcraft gets out, at first he's against this idea. We cannot let anybody know that witchcraft is suspected because it'll look poorly upon him. Anomalies, paradoxes, inconsistencies. Miller in his authorial intrusion makes the comment that humanity is flawed, and that this is a paradox cannot rise above the paradox of experience. Exclusion is necessary for social unity, central paradox of the play. So this is such a repressed society, and everybody has to be so unified that when somebody acts out of line, they sort of have to be called out. So there's this big sort of, and this is, not just a paradox here, but a paradox, a conflict, a dichotomy throughout humanity, and that's sort of this idea of order versus freedom. Increasingly informed justice, it's about a purpose and structure. Again, you can use the authorial intrusions here. I'll make some points when we go through this about the exposition, which is the very beginning of the play, how it's set up, the stage, and how it's sort of revealing of the society itself. Invites the reader to see the world differently, challenge assumptions, ignite new ideas, or reflect personally. So repeated authorial intrusions, he's sort of guiding us how to feel about all this stuff as well. And he makes explicit links to the 1950s, very thinly veiled, that this is connected to modern times. Miller consider the role of storytelling throughout time to express and reflect particular lives and cultures. And again, because of the nature of this allegorical nature, and because this is actual events, and he's linking this to today, he's sort of stating how these two places are linked. And storytelling is critical, not only then, but now. He comments on the universal nature of the conflict and paradox of human nature, personal and societal experience that illustrate in his narrative. Miller is aware of his role as a storyteller and makes references to himself and his context. These self-referential points that he makes, especially in the authorial intrusions, is him sort of signifying that he sees his role as important, as letting people know that this happened. So here's some techniques. I'm thinking, so I'll just tell you the pages. We'll go through these when I go through the actual act, but there's some dramatic irony on page 22. There's authorial intrusions without, 27, 13, 22. The stage direction in the opening, before Paris comes in as well, right at the beginning. And there's foreshadowing throughout as well. The biggest part of foreshadowing is at the very end when all the girls start calling out names because they realize that in order to save themselves, they need to accuse others. And that's going to be sort of a central part of this whole play. Is that paradox that in order to prove you're innocent, you need to confess to being guilty and accuse others, right? The only way to get out of being accused a witch is to say, yes, I am a witch. They're witches too, and then you're in the clear. But if you say, no, I'm not a witch, because that's ridiculous, witches don't exist, and they say, well, obviously you're a witch then, because you're denying it. So it's a paradox, but it's also sort of foreshadowing what's going to happen throughout the rest of the text. So we'll go through more of this stuff, but authorial intrusion, stage direction should be pretty easy to find. And there's a few examples of dramatic irony throughout as well that we'll go through when I get to this stuff. Links to context. Introduce us to this fear and paranoia, and this is linked to this idea of communism. It's the same thing, right? Communism. If you were accused of communism, there's very little you could do. If you went up there and said you weren't a communist, they'd say we don't believe you, and other people would be saying, yeah, I think he's a communist, without really any basis for it whatsoever, and that would be used just as to justify that you were up there. A lot of accusations that turn people against each other. The collectives, against the individual, and it became an opportunity for people to sort of get people out of the way as well. If you didn't like your neighbor, if you didn't cut his lawn, his tree was hanging over your fence, whatever, I think he's a communist, and then he's gone. So links to our own context. There's a lot of stuff that we're seeing here today, especially anti-immigrant rhetoric, in the States in recent years, and even in this country as well. Absolutely. So, this stuff is continuing on to this day, and this is going to be critical for you to make contemporary relevances when you're writing your responses. So those are things to consider. How do these things link to today's events, and how do these things remain relevant? So you're going to copy what's highlighted here, and you're going to complete this exercise. So here in this passage, he introduces Reverend Hale with a commentary on the dichotomy of human nature. In this way, Miller establishes Reverend Hale as one of the most morally complex characters in the play, as he used as a representation of Miller's own questions about humanity. So he lists a number of dichotomies. So sort of opposite sort of ideas, right? Good and bad, light and dark. Miller lists a number of dichotomies. So these God and Lucifer, God's beard and the devil's horns, morality and sin, good and evil, positive and negative attributes of the same force, man's worthlessness and redemption. So what is Miller trying to reveal about human nature by listing all of these dichotomies? Does he think human nature can be defined? So that's your question. Here's some questions. I think we've already done these. If you haven't, they should be in your books. So, either today or you've already done them. So it's up to you. So here's a question for you. IQ Tell question. How does the play introduce the paradoxes of human behavior? So you should choose a paradox. There's a lot of paradoxes that you can choose from. And this first one, it might be the collective versus the individual. Maybe not so. Maybe towards the end, this idea of guilty and innocent, of having to confess to being guilty in order to be innocent. And here is a sample. So the Representation of dichotomies of humanity reveals the paradoxical nature of human experience. Broad idea sentence that addresses the question. And then you get into the text. Arthur Miller's The Crucible provides a commentary on individual complexities through an understanding of the necessity of an innate, although contrasting human values. And this is talking about those dichotomies. So Miller, he's talking. So both of in these dichotomies, both of these ideas are true of humanity, but they completely contrast each other. And so Miller is highlighting that to us, that human beings are complex, and the simplicity by which these institutions persecute people is wrong, essentially. So in his authorial intrusion, introducing Reverend Hale, conceptualizes God and the devil, suggests that good and evil are relative, ever-changing, and always joined to the same phenomenon. By associating Hale with this commentary on human nature, Miller forces his responders to consider the diametrically opposed absolutes that make up human qualities to highlight this principle, that humanity is based on inherent contradiction. That we are not black and white. We are very much gray. Consolidate his representation of the paradoxical definition. Miller characterizes Reverend Paris and Reverend Hale as character foils to highlight the different qualities of human behavior. Paris' flawed judgment in the stage direction, studies her, then nods half convinced, shows his conviction in hearsay to suggest his inability to see beyond society's facade. This is later contrasted to Hale's, introduced in the stage direction as loaded down with half a dozen heavy books. By contrasting irrationality and reason within the institution of religion, Miller portrays the dichotomy evident in the systems of power. Hale is very representative of the theocracy at first, right? He's loaded down with these heavy books. There's knowledge behind him. There's wisdom behind him. At least that's how it appears, right? That's the facade. In the opening act, Miller dramatizes the paradoxes of human behavior. So we could talk about the dichotomies, right? We could talk about this collective versus individual, right, where there's a repressive collective society, there's no room for individual freedom, thus leading to problems moving forward, as with the girls dancing in the woods, and that there has to be some sort of explanation for it. And you could also talk about this paradox of accusation that happens later in this act. So I'll leave you here. It was a little longer than I expected, but solid work, boys. And I'm going to release another video that goes through just sort of overviews parts of Act 1. I'm not going to go through it intensely. I don't want to read the whole thing. It's going to take too long, but just over some of the finer parts and some of the things I want you to focus on while reading it. So I'll see you soon.